NASA did not lose Mars. It lost the part of Mars that answers back. That was the real disturbance. The planet was still there, still circling the sun, still carrying its dust, its dead valleys, its ancient rock, its cold horizon, and the machines humanity had scattered across its surface and around its sky. But one of those machines stopped talking. No explosion, no dramatic final image, no cinematic collapse the public could instantly recognize. Just silence. NASA says the spacecraft was MAVEN, which has orbited Mars since 2014, and that it was last heard from on December 6th. The agency says an anomaly review board is evaluating recovery efforts, MAVEN's probable current state, and the likelihood of recovery. That sounds like an engineering update. It isn't. It is a warning disguised as routine language, because the deeper problem was never just one spacecraft. The deeper problem is how little Mars has to lose before it starts feeling far away again. That is the story. Most people still imagine Mars exploration through the visible pieces. Launch, landing, rover tracks, panoramas. Maybe one day, astronauts. That version feels clean because it is built from the parts cameras can show. But Mars is not held together by the visible parts alone. Mars is held together by continuity. And continuity is mostly invisible. NASA's Mars Relay Network page makes this plain. Mars operations rely on an international constellation of 5 spacecraft orbiting the planet, relaying valuable science data from surface missions back to Earth, while also carrying out their own science work. That single fact changes the whole emotional shape of the story, because it means a Mars rover is never just a rover. Its voice depends on something above it. Its presence in human life depends on a hidden layer of orbital support that most viewers never think about until one part of that layer goes quiet. The rover gets remembered. The relay keeps it from becoming mute. And that is why MAVEN matters. Not because the public followed its every move, but because Mars has always been less self-sufficient than the public story makes it feel. We like to talk about Mars as if it is gradually becoming familiar. Maybe it isn't. Maybe it is only becoming familiar looking. There is a difference. A place can look known and still be fragile. A place can look occupied and still be thinly connected. A place can look active and still depend on a small number of quiet systems not failing at the wrong time. That is the real hook here. Not a spacecraft anomaly. A planet held together by more fragility than people realized. And fragility becomes most frightening when it reveals itself quietly. If a lander crashes, everyone understands the drama. If a launch fails, the story writes itself. If a rover dies on the surface, people feel the loss immediately. But when an orbiter goes silent, the failure feels smaller than it really is. That is exactly why it matters more. Invisible systems are always underestimated right up until they stop working. Then suddenly everyone discovers how much was resting on them. Mars is full of that kind of hidden dependency. That is where the story gets darker. Because a communications problem at Mars is not just a communications problem. It is uncertainty spreading outward through distance. The spacecraft may still exist. It may still be partly alive. It may still be recoverable, or it may not. NASA's own wording reflects that fog. Probable current state, likelihood of recovery. Those are cold phrases. They tell you that distance has already started doing what distance does best, separating the mission from certainty. And once certainty is weakened, the emotional character of Mars changes immediately. Mars stops feeling like a managed frontier and starts feeling like what it really is, a place that can become harder to reach without moving an inch. That may be the strongest line in the whole story. Mars does not have to move farther away to feel farther away. It only has to stop responding. That is what makes the silence around MAVEN so useful as a documentary subject. It exposes the difference between distance as a number and distance as a condition. Mars is always far in miles, but sometimes it becomes far in a worse way. Operationally far, emotionally far, systemically far. That is what silence does. And silence is a very Mars-like form of danger. Not loud, not theatrical. Just the sudden realization that the connection holding the illusion of proximity together was thinner than you thought. That illusion matters because Mars has been collecting legitimacy for years. Enough orbiters, enough landers, enough successful surface missions, enough imagery, enough public repetition. Over time, the planet starts to feel almost steady in the human mind, as if the presence we have there is broader and more secure than it actually is. MAVEN's silence cuts straight through that. It says, not so fast. You are still dealing with Mars, a place where continuity is earned, not guaranteed. A place where the hidden scaffolding matters as much as the heroic surface image. A place where one quiet failure can reveal more truth than 10 beautiful panoramas. That is why this story is stronger than a typical anomaly report. It is not really about a malfunction. It is about dependency becoming visible. NASA's relay description is what makes the whole thing click. The orbiters do not just float above the planet doing isolated science. They help carry Mars surface data home. That means orbital continuity is not background decoration. It is part of the operational nervous system of Mars exploration. That phrase matters, operational nervous system, because nervous systems are what let complicated bodies remain coordinated. And you only truly notice a nervous system when part of it stops signaling properly. That is exactly what this feels like. Not death. Exposure. Mars suddenly looks more exposed than it did before. Not empty, not abandoned, exposed. That is the right emotional word for the video because it keeps the story honest. This is not about pretending one lost contact event means the whole Mars effort is collapsing. It is about recognizing that the effort is more delicate than the audience was trained to assume, and honest fragility is stronger than fake catastrophe. The cheap version of this topic would invent secrets. The stronger version stays with the truth. NASA lost contact with MAVEN. NASA is evaluating what state it is likely in and whether it can be recovered. And that alone is enough to reveal something larger. Mars is one silence away from feeling much less under control than we like to imagine. That is not clickbait. That is the architecture of the problem. This is where the human stakes finally sharpen. People often push human Mars missions into a separate category, as if robotic exploration and human survival are two unrelated conversations. They are not. Robotic Mars missions are already showing us the hidden systems a human future would depend on. Relays, continuity, timing, orbital support, the ability to keep the planet legible from far away. A human crew would not erase those dependencies. It would intensify them. And that means the real question is no longer just how to land people on Mars. It is how to stop Mars from becoming operationally isolated once people are there. That is a much better question, a colder one too. Because if robots are already dependent on a thin orbital relay structure, then the first true crisis of a future human Mars mission may not begin on the surface at all. It may begin overhead, with loss of continuity, with degraded communication, with uncertainty spreading through a network that was never as thick or as effortless as the public imagined. That is what MAVEN's silence previews, not the failure of Mars. The cost of pretending Mars was ever stable. And stability is the key word here. Mars was never stable. It only looked stable from Earth. That is the hard pivot the viewer has to feel. Because once that lands, the story stops being NASA lost contact with a spacecraft and becomes the apparent permanence of Mars exploration was thinner than it looked. That is a genuine hidden truth angle. Not invented, not tabloid, earned. The best documentary versions of space stories do not exaggerate the facts. They force the audience to see the facts from the angle that hurts more. This is that angle. A long-serving spacecraft that helped make Mars feel normal goes quiet. An agency begins speaking in the language of probable state and recovery likelihood. The relay network, which NASA itself says helps return valuable surface data to Earth, suddenly stops feeling like background context and starts feeling like the true backbone of the whole planetary operation. And with that, Mars changes. Not physically, narratively, psychologically, operationally. It stops feeling like a place we are steadily mastering and starts feeling like a place that still depends on too few quiet successes. That should make people more uneasy than another generic Mars discovery ever could. Because discoveries expand wonder. Silence exposes weakness, and weakness is always more revealing. This is also why the title works. The day NASA stopped hearing Mars is strong because it says exactly enough and no more. It lets the audience feel the wrongness before the explanation arrives. NASA did not lose the planet, but it did lose one of the systems that made the planet feel reachable in a practical sense. That is a different kind of loss. Smaller in appearance, larger in implication, and implication is where the story wins. Because the real threat was never that Mars itself had become unreachable overnight. The threat was that the distance between we have a presence there and we are one silence away from partial isolation turned out to be much smaller than most people assumed. That is the sentence this whole video has been circling. Mars is not just distant. Mars is thinly connected. That is why the story matters right now, not someday. Right now, surface missions already depend on orbital relays. Right now, the image of Mars as a place under growing human control depends on hidden continuity above the planet. Right now, one orbiter going quiet is enough to remind everyone that presence is not the same thing as security. That distinction becomes even more important when people start talking about crewed futures as if they are mainly propulsion challenges. They are not. They are continuity challenges too. Infrastructure challenges. Redundancy challenges, nervous system challenges. The real burden of living at Mars will not only be surviving the surface, it will be preserving the network that keeps the surface from falling into silence. And that is why this story lands so hard emotionally, because it takes something the audience assumed was stable and reveals that the stability was conditional all along. We thought Mars was becoming normal. Maybe it was only becoming legible. We thought our presence there was accumulating into something close to permanence. Maybe it was only accumulating into the appearance of permanence. We thought distance was the main problem. Maybe continuity is worse. Those are the pivots that turn an update into a documentary. And they all come honestly from the same event. NASA stopped hearing MAVEN. That is enough. Enough to expose the hidden scaffolding. Enough to reframe Mars as a communications ecology, not just a destination. Enough to make the audience feel, maybe for the first time, that another planet can be busy and still one silence away from feeling empty again. That is the line I would want the viewer to carry out of the video. Not that Mars is cursed, not that NASA is hiding something impossible, something colder, something truer. Mars does not need a catastrophe to become frightening. It only needs one of its quiet voices to disappear. NASA is still assessing MAVEN's probable condition and the odds of recovery. So the final outcome is not the deepest point. The lesson is already here. Mars did not remind us how far away it is. It reminded us how little it takes to feel far away again. And that is why this story matters. Because the day people depend on Mars the way our robots already do, silence will stop sounding technical. It will sound like isolation. And the most dangerous part of that future will not be the planet itself. It will be how easily the connection can thin before anyone notices what has really been lost.